we could soon get some resolution to one of the many antitrust lawsuits the NCAA is currently facing. Reports surfacing this week of a potential settlement in the House versus the NCAA case. Our next guest has a great explainer video out on YouTube about all the complexities of this case, but today we're going to focus on the multi-billion-dollar settlement that could rock college sports as we know it. So let's welcome on said guest, Bud Elliott of the Cover 3 podcast. Bud, we talked about this. We're still not quite sure maybe how the proposed settlement actually leaked, but it did. Now we have our eyes on it. What are the highlights of this settlement?
Emily, so the House case is, as you said, one of the many antitrust cases that the NCAA is facing. Probably not a great position to have multi-antitrust cases going against you at once. And this one is kind of a doozy. So the House case is for back NIL, essentially claiming that schools via the NCAA all colluded to prevent athletes from earning income via NIL over the previous eligible period. So now they're like, hey, we want our money that we didn't get, that we would have had if you guys didn't have these illegal rules, you didn't collude. That's America. We call that antitrust, right? That's collusion, not exactly allowed unless you collectively bargain for it, which they don't do yet. And it got put in front of Judge Claudia Wilkin, who is kind of tough and does not really buy a lot of these NCAA arguments based on previous NCAA cases that have gone in front of them. So not really great cards for the NCAA to play here. And if they don't settle it, they could be between $2 and $4 billion with a B dollars in damages. So treble damages there. A lot of incentive for the NCAA to settle here. I know from some of the reporting out there, kind of 15 to 20 million per school is what we're potentially looking at for a settlement, as well as Attorney Jeffrey Kessler, who's leading the case for the plaintiffs, wants to have a new revenue sharing model going forward if they do settle it. It looks like this thing is probably going to settle. Details still being worked out, but honestly, this is a really interesting thing for the sport.
Yeah, the interesting part about the settlement is not just the money that's involved, but how it could rock the sport as we know it. And there's potentially a revenue sharing model. Can you explain a little bit more about how this could affect the future for payments for student athletes?
Sure. So part of this proposed settlement, and again, we don't know who leaked it, so we don't know what side it'll probably sway to more or the other, maybe it's 30 million, maybe it's 10, but it looks like part of the leaked settlement proposal is that we'll have a revenue sharing model going forward, which is one of the things that the plaintiffs asked for. And I think this is important for the long term of the sport. We know that we're likely going to some sort of revenue sharing model with the players. We saw Texas A&M lay off 15 athletic department employees in anticipation of having to shift money from the athletic department directly to the players in the coming year. So that was Trev Alberts, the new AD of A&M, just coming out and being very blunt and very honest and kind of forward thinking about his process there, unfortunately. So this is really important. Now, this also could matter a lot for getting the antitrust exemption long term. The NCAA has gone to Congress a couple times, be like, hey, please help us out. Please declare that players are not employees. Please declare that we have an antitrust exemption. Now, it's an election year. It's probably not going to happen in this year. But one of the things we've heard back from some reporting around Congress is that Congress is not really all that kind of fired up to act on this because the NCAA, to this point, and its member schools, have not helped themselves do anything about this. If they do agree to a revenue sharing model, then they can go back to Congress and say, hey, we've taken some affirmative steps to solve our own problems. There are some problems that we really can't solve without you helping us out with this. Can you take this ball and get it across the goal line after we already worked it down in here to kind of the congressional red zone, so to speak?
Something that you mentioned too is that word that comes up a lot, and that is employee. But a revenue sharing model is different from classifying athletes as employees. That's actually an entirely different lawsuit. But how is this not technically employment?
So it's not technically employment if they term it as NIL, if they don't have certain preconditions on receiving the money, potentially if they don't work directly for the school, if there's some sort of third party go between. For instance, maybe we had the University of Football or University of Tennessee Football Club, right, where they're almost like a school's medical center is not actually owned by the school. They simply license the name from the school. There are some various kind of dubious ways you could potentially do this. How long they would actually hold up to court scrutiny if you don't get that antitrust exemption, would be up for debate, certainly. But there are a lot of people out there that are hoping that they can do this and not make the players employees, which would save the schools a lot of money. Of course, I think most of the players would say, yeah, we're probably employees if getting paid is preconditioned on like showing up when you say, playing in these games, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so if it's not an employee relationship and it leans more towards the NIL side of things, I think the next question is, how could this potentially affect collectives?
It's a really interesting question. I think what you will probably see is more schools looking to kind of claw back some of that control. And that's not saying that they are adversarial in nature with their relationship with collectives. I think a lot of schools have had decent or good relationships with their collectives, and their collectives stepped up at a much needed time to help them retain their players and, of course, maximize their marketing opportunities, of course, especially when it comes to transfer portal season. But I think a lot of schools would look to claw back a little bit of control, maybe bring those collectives in-house and kind of have the left hand talking to the right hand, know what they're doing. Okay, we're giving this much in revenue sharing. How much extra are we giving in NIL opportunities above and beyond, what the rev share is, if we are going to do anything at all? So I think in many cases, we will probably see collectives go in-house and become sort of a part of the university marketing arm in some ways at some schools.
It seems like we've all kind of graduated from the initial pearl clutching of what's it going to be like when these student athletes get paid? What's, all of that going to be like? And more lean towards just the exhaustion from the player movement. Obviously, a lot of that has to do with NIL and the money that's being doled out. But I said it at the top of the show. I mean, we're as college football fans, sometimes it gets exhausting just going on the website and trying to figure out who's suiting up for my team this fall. So how could this revenue sharing model with programs potentially, hopefully, slow down that player movement?
Emily, you nailed it. Contracts. If you have a guy locked in for 2 years, he can't go play for another team, right? I just signed with CBS for 2 years. I can't go do an ESPN thing half a year from now, right? Like, I'm locked in. That's how this will work for the players for the most part. Just like professional leagues will. Now, you could say, what about buyouts? Couldn't you get bought out? I guess in theory, but I don't know that schools want to engage in buying players out of contracts. Of course, we also probably said that at some point in time about coaches, and we certainly see that. But yeah, I've never really had, like on Cover 3, I look at the chat all the time, the live chat, and shout out to the chat here on 24/7 Sports. But like, I never really see people complaining that much about the players getting paid. I see them complain a lot about the inability to form like a multi-year connection with players on their roster. Like, hey, I had high hopes for this guy as a freshman. Now I'm excited to see him as a sophomore. That part is somewhat being robbed of the sport. Now, I think it's good players have the right to move around. It's not always great for the actual sport if you can't form that connection with your roster. So having guys locked up on multi-year deals is probably a really good thing for building and maintaining fandom.
Oh, 100%. We had a meeting actually this morning. I'm on the Belmont right there, my alma mater, the Hall of Fame committee. And we had this extensive conversation about what do we do with transfers? Are they considered to be part of the Hall of Fame, even if they were awesome for us and then left after a few years? And you just see so much player movement that, as you said, it's hard to build that connection. Elsewhere in the sport, we see a lot of movement when it comes to conference realignment. I do recommend fans go out and refamiliarize yourself with who's playing in which conference this year. But how could this settlement and the big changes coming to college football impact conference realignment?
So this is really the coming change that was in large part the driving force behind Florida State and Clemson, suing the ACC to get out, right? From their perspective, let's take Clemson. If you're Clemson, you've won, 2 national titles in the last 10 years. You're doing a great job. You fill your stadium. Your talent acquisition operation's going great. You recruit your butts off. But what happens if all of a sudden player acquisition is like coach acquisition, and all of a sudden it's based on your revenue share, and South Carolina is bringing in 3 or 3.5x what you bring in? Same thing with Florida State. Like, Florida State doesn't want to be in a spot where Mississippi State is making triple what FSU makes. There are certain schools, I think, in certain leagues who are like, hey, if our goal is to compete at the very highest level, we got to get out, or a decade from now, we're in trouble. So that is in large part, I think, what has some of the remaining like premier brands in the non-Big 2 leagues kind of freaked out a little bit and going to court.
It's the revenue part of the revenue share. If you're in a conference that doesn't bring as much revenue in, then potentially there's less to share with the athletes. Bud, thank you so much for making simple work of a very complicated situation. I'm looking forward to seeing more of your work. And of course, you can listen to him on the Cover 3 podcast, Bud and the gang. They get you covered. Our CBS Sports College Football experts, insiders. They give you the best coverage all year long. And soon, I got to promo this, Bud's Summer School Series is coming out. Trust me, if you want to be the smartest fan this fall, you will want to make sure that you listen to that. Check out the Cover 3 podcast.